We're joined back for a panel discussion, as I said, with the Minister. Finbarr O'Shea, CEO of Bantry Credit Union, is here too. We have Ruth Buggie, who's head of the Green Communities Programme at the SEAI, and Colm Tynan, Programme Leader of the Sustainable Energy Engineering course in WIT. And we'd also ask everyone tuning in to take part in our panel discussion too. There's an opportunity, there's a Q&A button on the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. Write your question into that, tap send, and we will do our best to get through as many of them as possible. Minister, very briefly before you go at 12 o'clock, you outlined the hugely ambitious programme for government, and particularly how it related to retrofitting our housing stock. It's ambitious, but how achievable do you think it really is?
Well, I'm quite ambitious because normally people say many targets don't ever get achieved, but some targets do get achieved in Ireland. And I think if the people can come behind an issue, I think it can be achieved. And I've given you the example of where a neighbour is getting a house retrofitted or work done. I think other people will follow suit. So there's a bit of a turning point, and I really believe the Irish people are like that. Years ago, they used to call it keeping up with the Joneses, but now I think people, if they see something good, they actually want to do it. But I'm listening to Duncan, and without getting it, I couldn't remotely take Duncan on anything he said, because he has so much knowledge that I'm learning listening to him. But what I do want to say is, from a government point of view, and this is the message I'm taking back from this here today, and it's not just the specifics of the plan that will be out in the coming weeks, it's how we as a government position what we're talking about. And I've learned one lesson in my public career in relation to environmental matters. And it was this, very early, a number of years ago in my career, and I think we didn't learn that lesson, and it caused a lot of unnecessary difficulties. And that was, and Duncan will understand this, years ago there were lots of landfill sites all over the country, lots of landfill sites, and people had one almost outside every major town and things like that. And the government came out to say, we're closing landfills and you can't do this anymore, and this is not the way of the future. And a lot of people objected to the closing of the landfills at the time, believe it or not. Where are we going to put our rubbish? And we've always put you either want us to burn it or put it in the landfill, and surely put it in the landfill. Whereas if the government was able to show the vision of where we were going to be now at the beginning, and said, there is a better way, and actually say, this is what the future will look like in 10 and 20 years for most of us. And if we looked at the level of recycling and reuse and the changes to packaging, that we've come a long way in that area, what I call was a very thorny issue. And one of the reasons that it was a little bit torturous, and maybe the same can be said to some of where the jobs are being lost at the moment, is people, the government and everybody tends to come and say, we've got to do this now, and there'll be benefits in the future. Whereas if they tell the people the benefits and let the people see the future, they'll very easily accept the change if they see a better future. But I don't think we have ever done that in Ireland, because it's a little bit long term. And sometimes I actually think it'd be more, the country would be better if we were to let out what Duncan is talking about, the vision of the future more, and people would then come around and say, well, we've got to do all this retrofitting and everything else we're talking about, rather than telling people this is the way it is and there will be benefits in the future. It's kind of, I suppose, getting the attitudes right, and it's a bigger selling message. And that's an observation as I listen here. The future can be much better, but I think sometimes we don't deal with that, and people only see the particular problems I'm going to have this week, next month, or my annual budget, if the cost of motoring goes up, or if the cost of filling the oil tank goes up, or whatever the case is. And we concentrate too much on the short-term problem this year, rather than the 5 and the 10 years. And I would say that's a lesson for us in society. We all know the green school thing. The younger people, the school, the best educator in most houses for recycling are the children who come home from school in many cases, and they bring it into their homes. And I think we really have to do a little bit more than that. It's a broader issue than today's particular debate, but I think we have to position where we want to be and let the people say, well, we want to get there, rather than fighting about making little changes here and now. So that's a broad comment. It's much directed at myself, my colleagues in government, and people at national level, because it's very easy in life. If you're doing something important for the future, people will say, well, what if I don't like this particular thing that's going to happen immediately in front of my house now? So I think we have to be a little bit broader in our response. So as I say, the government plan, I'm told, is imminent within weeks. I know to mention this one, but I'm told it's imminent within weeks. And beyond that, I don't know. I'm personally not in the cabinet, Minister of State for Credit Union. So beyond that, I can't really say this morning.
Well, thank you, Minister, and we do appreciate you joining us, and I'm conscious that you need to be gone, but thank you very much for your time. Thank you. Ruth, I'm going to come to you now. You're working with the SEAI. As Duncan said in his presentation, the average energy rating of a home in Ireland is D. Is the first step people should do is figure out, the first time I got my house energy rating was when I was selling it, and that's probably the way most people do it. So is the first thing we should do is figure out what our home's BER is?
It's a really good starting point for homeowners to consider that. But I would say as well is that 1 in every 3 homes in Ireland has a building energy rating. So it might be just a case of reaching out to a neighbour if you live on a road with similar homes to find out, has anyone already had one done? And that might be a good indication. Another good starting point is to consider tracking your energy use. So seeing where you're actually spending your energy between heating, electricity and transport. And that can also help identify where the best opportunities might be for your household. Duncan spoke about $1 million spent on retrofit and the jobs that come out of it. Every 250 homes spend about €1 million on energy. And with very simple changes and upgrades, it's quite easy to save 10% of that. And with the credit union movement and the interest in keeping money locally, saving 10% within 250 homes is €100,000 for that community to stay local and not get shipped off to buy oil or gas overseas. And with grants and the work and the support being done with Greenify, that could easily go up to 25% saving. And that accrues every single year within a community. So this is a real recurring benefit, and I suppose an enduring benefit from people take action for themselves immediately, but also for the much wider community as well.
Colm, I'll come to you before even, as Ruth was saying, the first thing is maybe figure out what your energy rating is. But there are other steps, surely, before you start spending money. So what are the first steps that homeowners who are living in a standard average house, a D rating, a C rating, BER, what are the first things you reckon they should do?
Yeah, so it's an interesting question. I suppose there's no one answer for that fits or will be right for every house. So you need to look at your own house, really. And as Ruth says, can you figure out, first of all, where you're spending your money? So if you think a lot of your money has been spent on heating your home, then maybe the next step is to think, well, why is my heating bill so high? So, and one of the main reasons in a lot of poorly insulated homes is that they can be quite drafty. So I'd always say to people, don't just think, oh, I need to insulate my home, it's going to make it warmer. Because if it's very drafty, probably the first thing you should be doing is trying to address, well, can I stop all this air infiltrating in and out of my house? Because if I go and insulate the house and it's still drafty, I'm still going to lose the majority of the heat. And that can be a very cheap solution. I mean, you can draft strip your windows, your doors, the attic hatch up into your, I mean, if that's leaky, we lose a huge amount of heat up into the attic. Very often you go into the hot press and there's someone, a plumber or an electrician, has bored a hole that's maybe 5 times too large for a pipe to go up into the attic. So all the heat is escaping out. And even though, I mean, we don't realize that as being energy loss, but if you think of every meter cubed of air that leaves your house at 20 degrees is being replaced by a meter cubed of air at maybe 0 degrees on a cold day. So that'll be the first step. Obviously, we always preach the gospel of fabric first when it comes to upgrades. So if you're going to spend money, spend it on the fabric first. And again, before you race off and decide, okay, I'm going to get my windows replaced, because that's part of the fabric, get an energy consultant to have a look at your house. And they will tell you if they do a survey, and it may be part of the BER survey, but they may give you some additional information as to which elements of your structure need to be addressed first. the cheapest is probably just insulating your attic. And we all probably have some insulation in our attic, but you know, I mean, the recommendation is to have 300 millimeters. So a lot of us wouldn't have 300 millimeters, and it's not expensive. There's actually a grant of €400 just to get your attics insulated. And for a 3-bedroom semi-detached house, it probably wouldn't cost you any more than €300 to get that, to buy the materials to do that. So there are simple steps that you can take. And then obviously after that, then you need to maybe start spending more money. But I suppose the key thing is to get good advice so that you don't go and spend money, say someone to say, oh, I'm going to put a heat pump into my house. That's okay if your building is well insulated and reasonably airtight. But if it's not, if it's an old house and it hasn't been thermally upgraded first, putting a heat pump in is actually going to use more energy and cost you more as well.
And as Colm mentioned there, Ruth, that there are grants available, and I actually was lucky enough to avail of an SEAI grant. I did a deep retrofit a couple of years ago and went from a G to an A2. So we're walking around in our swimming togs half the time in our house, Ruth. Can you go through some of the grants that are available to people? Because a lot of people mightn't be aware of it.
Sure. So we have a number of different programs in SEAI that have been running for quite some time, and some new ones that have come on board. So the one that most people might be aware of might be the Warmer Home Scheme, which is there for people who might need some additional help. So typically people in receipt of the likes of the fuel allowance, and they can actually get the work done for free. So we go out and do a survey of their home and send out a contractor and pay for all the work. So that's the one for people in receipt of certain benefits, and that can really help people out. And all the information is on our website at seai.ie home grants. Then we have the individual grant, so that covers, as Colm said, so attic insulation from €400, cavity wall insulation to similar level, and then internal wall and external wall insulation at the same, depending on what type of home you have, all the way up to €6,000. There's grants there for heating control upgrade for €700, solar photovoltaic, so generating electricity, and in some places you can put in a battery storage, there's a grant for that as well. Solar thermal to make hot water, so that's also a grant. And we also have then a grant for an EV charger in your home as well. And the heat pump grant is there as well. So that's up to €3,500. There's quite a range there. But as Colm said, getting a detailed energy assessment of your home is a really good starting point to identify what's best fit for you. And for some people, that's one go. So Helen, when you and I spoke, you mentioned you did the big bang, you did it all in one go, or you had the opportunity and you leapt from a G to an A. For some people, it can be a staged process. So fabric first, very much as Colm said, and working your way up. And in some cases, it might be about getting heat pump ready. So you're looking at the ventilation and the infiltration in your home. You're looking at the thermal insulation, and you're moving to a point that when your boiler may come to its natural life end, that you're ready to put a heat pump in, and it's not a big giant jump at that stage. So there's a lot of grants there. Really encourage people to have a look at our website, and there's buyer's guides and everything and information available for people to get a help there.
Right. Duncan, one thing that really struck me, and it's a figure I hadn't heard before when you were speaking, was that heating our buildings accounts for 34%, I think, out of our energy-related emissions. So it's really important that we change the way we heat our homes, isn't it?
Yes, because 2/3 of that, Helen, is the heating for our homes in space heating. And of course, that's a big chunk of our energy-related CO2. 2/3 of the 34% that we talked about, you know, so it's a big chunk, you know. But if we look at that and say, you know, what we can do with it, and I think there's a lot of good comments being made already. Well, I think when we look to community energy, forming a community energy group, in others, the sustainable energy communities that SEAI run, that Ruth is doing, in my view, is one of the first steps for people to do, is to come together, form a group, look at your homes, get in an assessor to look at it, you know, a competent engineer or architect or energy assessor that knows these issues well, and that advises all of you together, and then look at the opportunities and the benefits of everybody pulling together. Just say you've got 10 houses on a street, or people living close to each other, or whatever, in a housing scheme, or in rural Ireland, for example, you know, coming together, because there's an economy of scale, there's expertise, there's skills there, there's know-how between the group. people on their own are very vulnerable, and they're very vulnerable to kind of companies coming in and selling products and promising all sorts of wonderful kind of stories about how successful these things are. But you're not always getting the honest advice. And it's so important that people get the real evidence and the real solutions that are going to deliver, you know. And you know, we have to realize that our homes are performing extremely badly. You know, we have to accept this, that we're way below the standards of Europe. And remember, only 2% of the energy for heating our homes is coming from renewable sources. It's 98% from oil, gas, coal, and peat. And we have to get off these. That, you know, really, it's shocking that we're still locked into these. And we need to look at the simple things like using an open fire. An open fire burning, say, turf or coal, for example, creates about 8 to 9 times the CO2 emissions of, say, a gas boiler. Now, I'm not a fan of fossil gas, but it is 1/9 of the cost of heating and 1/9 of the emissions compared to an open fire. You know, well, sorry, not 1/9 of the cost, but 1/9 of the CO2 emissions, but certainly a lot less costly also than an open fire. You know,
one thing, sorry.
We have to kind of realize these things are very, very energy consuming and carbon intensive.
You mentioned about getting, I suppose, trustworthy advice, Duncan, and another thing that's important to get is to get, I suppose, knowledgeable from people who know what they're talking about. And one thing you've done that I think is really interesting with Greenify, Finbarr, is that the loan officers in the participating credit unions have actually been educated. They've done a course so they can, I suppose, give educated advice when customers come in.
Yes, certainly, Helen, and that's one of the core principles of the Greenify project. And obviously, thank you to Colm and people in WIT and the things, because in some parts of those courses we were thinking like we're not engineers and when the formulas were coming out and we were struggling with that. But we were always taking on board the key messaging from it and the key messages. And as again, Colm has mentioned the 2 of them there today that are burnt into my mind, and I think everybody else who did it, is the fabric first. But even more than the fabric first, it's the sound advice. So credit union loans officers are loans people. We're credit union people. We're finance people. We're not engineers, but our advice to our members will be to get the sound advice. And that's where our stakeholder platform and our engagement with the local engineers and building those networks in our community. Because it's an absence, it's the lack of information is frightening. Like Duncan, listening to Duncan and to see and to hear how bad, let's call it, how disgracefully bad we are in comparison even with our European colleagues and the rest of Europe. Like we like to think ourselves as being, you know, the Green Ireland and the rest of it, but we're obviously terribly bad laggards in all this respect. But I think the media obviously has a role, and a person could go on all of these. I'll stop there. It's not about so much that, but within the local community, what can we do ourselves? And so the stakeholder platform, reaching out, there's so many of them on this meeting now, local tradespeople, I see local politicians and so on, because the call to action from Duncan, it's so frightening, it's so stark. And then the good news is what Ruth and Colm are bringing, the practical steps we can do. And, you know, that's hopefully will be a little piece of that jigsaw.
There is good news, definitely, that there are practical steps, but unfortunately we've seen construction prices just soar in the last few months. And I presume, Colm, that means that the cost of energy upgrades has increased as well.
Yes, unfortunately it has. Some people blame Brexit, some people blame the COVID crisis. I suppose it's a combination of everything. And then the cost of energy for shipping materials, so a container used to cost €3,000 to ship something halfway around the world, and now I think it costs €18,000. So materials that have been brought in from other parts of the world. I think Duncan kind of hit the nail on the head there. We need to use local products like timber that's grown in Ireland, takes the carbon out of the atmosphere, and then we store it, and maybe get away from some of these more these products that are being manufactured and are consuming vast amounts of energy in that process, that embodied energy that's in it. But I suppose on the flip side, it is costing more. There is a lot of media speculation that the price of construction materials will come back down again next year. Hopefully they will, but the cost of energy is continuing to rise. And I mean, if I think at the moment, even say I use oil at home, kerosene, I have an oil boiler, I live in the countryside, and I think I paid 82 cents a litre only a couple of weeks ago. Now, last year it was only 40 something cents a litre. Now, that was very low, the price had gone down. But I mean, over the last 20 years, fossil fuel prices have at least doubled. And they predict they'll double again in the next 10 years. On top of that, the government are imposing carbon tax, which is $7.50 per tonne of CO2, which is about 2 cents per litre of oil each year they're going to add on. So you can see that the price of fossil fuels is rising, which means the price of energy is rising all the time. And you mean, as an energy engineer, I actually welcome that price rise because it makes energy upgrades more affordable, or not affordable, but the payback on it comes down because we're going to save ourselves a lot more energy. I also think, I mean, people always think about cost, but you should always think about cost versus comfort. So we spend a lot of time in our homes. About 50% of our lives are in our homes, and in the last couple of years, probably a lot more. I mean, and you have to think about your house being warm, being comfortable, being healthy, it's energy efficient, has low emissions. You know what I mean? And we shouldn't underestimate all that. Every room.
Colm, sorry, healthy is a big part of it now at the moment.
Yeah.
Ventilation with COVID, and again, that's another benefit of doing retrofitting your home. Your air quality can improve.
Yes, I mean, and in your houses now, you know, we would install mechanical ventilation heat recovery systems all the time, so that we actually control the rate of ventilation in our homes, and combining that with proper insulation upgrades, we can eradicate condensation and mold growth in our homes, have much better air quality. We can guarantee that we have a proper air supply throughout the house. And I know some of the grant schemes, particularly the ones that Duncan mentioned, where groups of people come together, you can now apply for grants for ventilation systems under that. I think the individual ones you can't, Ruth, but I think in some of the group schemes you can. And there was a new one launched there, I think this year, wasn't there? The
one-stop shops.
The one-stop shop for the communities. I know I had it written down. The National Homes Retrofit Scheme, is that the new one? Yeah, with one-stop shops where you get good advice as a group of people. But I suppose within the house, yeah, being healthy, a healthy home is a nice place to live, you know what I mean? And the other thing is that when you do an upgrade is that your whole house becomes useful again. Lots of us have homes that before they were upgraded, we had spare bedrooms and maybe a dining room that we never used because it was always cold in there. It was, you know what I mean? And so we only lived in half our home. Where you get an upgrade, your house becomes accessible, all the rooms are warm, and we use the house more.
Ruth, one thing Finbarr had mentioned, I think when we said 10 to 50,000 of a loan is what's within this Greenify scheme. Can you do a lot, I presume, with 10 to 50,000?
You can, and the programme that you were involved in, that deep retrofit programme, the average spend in that case was €50,000. At the time, the grant was 50% of that. So that was bringing homes up to an A2. So it was a very extensive retrofit. So the amount being given is a really excellent fit for the type of up to the deep retrofit that people might want to do, but also allows them to do a stage process as well. So it's an excellently scaled programme for the grants that are needed to support that work.
We're coming towards the end of it, and I have got some questions from the audience that I'll put to the panel. One question, Finbarr, this might be one for you. Will loans be gross or net of grants? Is that something you can answer?
If I can answer that, I think the loan is separate from the grant, but always within a credit union loan, and not to get too technical, you can always pay back. So for instance, if somebody's job was, it's gross of, so if somebody was doing works to the value of €50,000, let's just say, and they were likely to get grant aided up, I'm guessing, say in the region of 15,000. The spend obviously has to go up first, so they would borrow the €50,000, pay for the works, get the grant, and then net the grant off the loan, and obviously leaving them with a residual €35,000 loan. So I hope that addresses the question.
There's another question from the panel. I don't know whether Ruth or Colm might answer this or be aware. Does the panel have any insight on the impact installation of solar PV systems may have on home insurance? I'm not sure if that's something that either of you will be aware of.
It's not something I'm aware of, but I'm happy to take the question back to my colleagues in the on the PV side to see if they're aware of the issue.
Okay, we might get in touch with the person who has asked that question. And then education, it's something that all of you touched on quickly, Finbarr, that some attendees are interested to hear more about the role of schools in the stakeholder platform. Do you envisage any specific role for transition year students in the Greenify project? Because I think, as Duncan said, it really is the children bringing home the information, they're educating their parents.
Well, we didn't have specifically transition year in mind, but it's a very good idea. And I mean, you can see the synergies, you can see the obviousness there. So again, that's a bit like Ruth taking her one back. That's definitely one we will take back into our group workings for sure.
To come back to you, Duncan, and it really was sobering listening to you. And the problem is so vast, but isn't there a danger that people think it is such a big problem? What I do or what I don't do won't really make an impact on that.
Yeah, well, of course, but I think we have to understand that it's collectively we can tackle this, you know, and I think we all have to understand we all have a role in this, a responsibility in this. And if we focus on our children, you know, we don't want to be in a situation that our children will question us in 10 years' time and say, why didn't we do it when the knowledge is there, the technology is there, you know, we know the problem was so serious. You know, we don't want to be in that situation that we're going to be held responsible ourselves for our lack of action, you know, and our homes are critically the place to identify it in, and our transport, those two areas, you know, where people can make such a big difference, you know. But education, going back to the education issue, you know, I'm very conscious of the need for this information to be embedded into the curriculum. And transition year is a really good place to do it. And I'm part of a group now that have set up Eco-Ed for All, which is focusing on climate change, biodiversity, circular economy, you know, pollution issues, all geared at teachers for transition year. We're working this through the education centres. But what I mean is information going back to parents from their children about these issues could make a huge difference. I mean, you know, school kids questioning their parents. We know there's going to be a revolution of young people. There's no doubt coming down the track over the next few years. Young people are now fighting for their future. You know, Greta Thunberg is doing wonderful in what she's doing. It's so important to listen to her, because this is the generation that are going to suffer the consequences of climate change at a very, very serious level. You know, we get towards 2050, could be 2040, we could see hundreds of millions of migrants pouring across the planet, starving because they have to abandon where they are with the impacts of climate change. This is what's coming down the track. And I mean, the problem will get totally out of control unless we are focusing too on protecting these people in their local areas and building capacity in these developing world regions that are under huge pressure from climate change, you know.
And no matter how vast,
we're facing big problems.
Absolutely, and no matter how vast the problem, every little bit does help. And one final question, I'm going to put it to you very briefly, Colm. There's a huge amount of work to do. A huge amount of our housing stock does need to be upgraded. And it is important, as Finbarr was saying, about keeping that spend locally, local money, to be spent locally. Do we have a skilled enough workforce? Do we have enough people qualified to upgrade our housing stock?
Probably not at the moment. But there are, you know, I mean, the ETBs around the country have a lot of training programs being put in place. And they're at different levels, you know, I mean, they're for tradespeople, but they're also maybe for a project management level. But in the third level sector, then, you know, I mean, we have courses running at undergraduate level, part-time courses now. So we have one in WIT, which is in NZEB design. It's a postgraduate certificate. We have master's programs, but I think a lot of these part-time programs allow people that are working in the sector maybe to come in and to upskill I think that's the key, is that lots of people know a little bit about what maybe we need to do, but they don't maybe know enough. And we need to get a bigger pool of people or experts that have the skills required going forward. Because we've 2 million houses in our country, roughly. At least 1.5 million of them probably need to be upgraded by 2050. We have a target of 500,000 by 2030, but we've a lot of people need to be brought into this sector to work.
Colm, that was the last question. I have one more last question. I don't have more last questions. I'll get another thing I've been told to say. Bernard O'Grady had a question, and in answer to him, yes, the recording will be available afterwards. Another question that's come in, finally to put to you, Ruth, that are the parameters for energy rating changing constantly? So could an A1 rating today be a lower rating in 5 or 10 years' time?
They're not changing. The process in which and the methodology is advancing, but it's not changing the bands. What is an A-rated home stays an A-rated home, and your BER certificate is valid for 10 years from the time you do it. So it's a very long-lasting product. Great. And Duncan, you wanted to come in with one final thing, did you there?
Well, yes, I think, well, first of all, our trades do need, all trades. I'm an architect, and I'm very conscious of a lot of good tradesmen out there trying to do but they just don't have the knowledge. And there needs to be, for every plumber, electrician, carpenter, blocker, right across, because they're all kind of in there and often undoing the work of other energy efficient measures that are being put in place. Like, in other words, if we draft seal and don't deal with ventilation, we can create unhealthy conditions. If somebody comes in to draft seal a house, the first thing you've got to look at is ventilation. Otherwise, they could make the house incredibly unhealthy. So these sort of measures need to be embedded into trades people right across, so that they understand each other's trades and the importance of it. And I think another thing that I think we need to look at is we need to find solutions for renewable energy for our homes, for heating. At the moment, the options are very little for people, especially in urban areas. What do you do other than use a heat pump, which in itself is not a zero carbon solution? It's just using ambient sources of energy very efficiently. And it is the only way to use electrical energy for heating, because any other form of use of electricity for heating is incredibly expensive and carbon intensive. So heat pumps are the solution there, but the other options are not there. And I believe there's a huge opportunity for farmers. And when I look at the Cultivate scheme that the credit unions are doing, if we could put the credit union Cultivate scheme with the energy systems that are required for homes, especially in rural Ireland, but also in our towns through district heating, there's great opportunities for biogas. There's great opportunities for biomass, for district heating, and for rural houses, And I feel there needs to be an awful lot more focus by government in this area of, and of course, the same applies for transport fuel. We have to get away from diesel and petrol. So we have to give people that have long distance commutes that are outside the range of electric, for example, but especially all of our trucks, which is 1/3 of our transport emissions, and all our buses could all be running on biomethane, So there's great opportunities for grass and for silage, along with farm slurry, to create biogas anaerobic digestion plants all over the country. And I mean 200, 300 plants around the country, to satisfy a choice of fuel that would also, for the farmers, help to reduce their carbon emissions on the farm. Because if 50% of their grass went to biogas, that would mean 50% less cattle on the farm, where farmers can't make a living out of cattle. 83% of farmers cannot make a living out of rearing cattle for beef. So those farmers could be making a living. The money could be kept locally, as Finbarr was talking about earlier, staying in the local economy for the farmers, first of all, but for the local people that are spending money on energy that's going out of the country, in the massive amount of oil that we're importing and gas we're importing. All that money could stay in the local economy. So what I mean is there's huge opportunities in that sector that are not there at the moment, being
And that's a good way to
realised.
leave it as well. It is a huge problem, but there are huge opportunities, whether it's for homeowners to avail of schemes like Greenify to upgrade their homes, for tradespeople, for farmers, that there are opportunities there and positives can be taken from, you know, from today. I'd like to, and the questions are still coming in, but I'm afraid we have run out of time. So I'd like to thank all of our panel for taking part. I'd like to thank all of our audience for becoming so involved and engaging so well with it all. We could go on for a long time. All of the questions that have come through, we will be still going through them, and other queries we will try our best to get back to you after the event. For more details, and if any of you would like to find out more about Greenify, if you visit greenify.ie, there's tons of information there. And once more, I'd like to thank everybody for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day.